The summer heat in Sicily made the air shimmer like a mirage as Marco Benedetti stepped off the bus in Palermo. He was 23 years old, fresh out of university with a degree in architecture, and had come to the island for what he thought would be a simple internship at a restoration firm. His worn leather satchel contained sketches of ancient buildings and dreams of preserving history. He had no idea that within weeks, his own life would become entangled with one of Italy's most dangerous crime families. The restoration company operated from a modest office near the Old Port District. Marco spent his first days measuring crumbling facades and cataloging damaged frescoes in forgotten churches. His supervisor, an elderly man named Giuseppe, warned him to keep his head down and avoid certain neighborhoods after dark. Marco dismissed these warnings as the paranoia of an old man who had lived through troubled times. 3 weeks into his internship, Marco was documenting a Baroque chapel when he noticed a young woman watching him work. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. Her designer dress and expensive jewelry seemed out of place in the dusty, abandoned building. When their eyes met, she smiled and approached him with a confidence that made his heart skip. Her name was Isabella Torrisi. She spoke with the refined accent of someone educated abroad, and her knowledge of art history impressed Marco immediately. She asked intelligent questions about his restoration work and seemed genuinely fascinated by the mathematical precision required to rebuild centuries-old structures. They talked for hours that first day, and she returned the next afternoon, and the one after that. Isabella never mentioned her family during those early conversations. She spoke of her studies in Paris, her love of Renaissance paintings, and her dream of opening an art gallery. Marco found himself looking forward to her visits more than the actual restoration work. He began bringing extra coffee and pastries, hoping she would stay longer. Their relationship deepened gradually. Isabella would text him locations of hidden architectural gems around Palermo, places tourists never found. They would meet in quiet cafes where she would tell him stories of the building's histories, weaving tales of noble families and ancient feuds. Marco was captivated not just by her beauty, but by her intelligence and passion for preserving Sicilian culture. The first sign of trouble came 6 weeks after they met. Marco was walking back to his small apartment when a black Mercedes pulled alongside him. 2 men in dark suits emerged and, politely but firmly, suggested he join them for coffee. The taller one mentioned Isabella's name, and Marco, confused but curious, agreed to go with them. The coffee shop was empty except for an older man sitting in the corner booth. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his suit probably cost more than Marco made in a year. This was Salvatore Torrisi, Isabella's father. He studied Marco with eyes that seemed to see through him, then spoke in a voice soft as silk but sharp as a blade. Salvatore explained that his daughter had spoken highly of Marco. He appreciated that the young man treated Isabella with respect and seemed to have genuine feelings for her. However, there were things Marco needed to understand about the Torrisi family. Things that could not be unlearned once known. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Salvatore never explicitly stated his position, but Marco understood. The construction companies that got the best contracts, the restaurants that never had trouble with permits, the politicians who always won elections, all of them had connections to the Torrisi family. Salvatore presented it as a form of traditional Sicilian governance, a parallel system that had existed for centuries. Marco left the meeting with his head spinning. He tried to reconcile the image of Isabella, cultured, gentle, passionate about art, with what he now knew about her family. When he saw her the next day, she could tell something had changed. Over dinner at a small trattoria, she finally told him the truth about her life. Isabella had grown up surrounded by bodyguards and bulletproof cars. Her education in Paris had been an attempt by her parents to give her a normal life, away from the violence and vendettas of Sicily. But she had returned home after graduation, unable to abandon her family despite knowing what they were. She loved her father, who had always been gentle with her, even as she despised the world he had built. She told Marco about the loneliness of being a Mafia princess. How potential friends disappeared when they learned her last name. How every relationship was tainted by fear or greed. She had approached Marco precisely because he was an outsider, someone who saw her as Isabella before learning she was a Torrisi. Marco faced an impossible choice. He was deeply in love with Isabella, but entering her world meant accepting realities that went against everything he believed. She told him she would understand if he left Sicily immediately and never contacted her again. The Torrisi family would ensure he departed safely and would not bother him in his future life. Instead, Marco asked for time to think. Isabella gave him 1 week, warning that after that, the choice would be made for him. Her father's patience had limits, and there were others in the family who viewed Marco's knowledge as a liability. During that week, Marco barely slept. He continued his restoration work mechanically, his mind constantly returning to Isabella. He researched the Torrisi family online, finding only vague references and society page photos. The real information existed in whispers and knowing glances, a shadow history of Sicily written in blood and silence. He met Isabella again at the Baroque chapel where they had first talked. She wore a simple black dress this time, as if already in mourning for what she expected him to say. But Marco surprised her. He had decided to stay, to try to build a life with her despite the circumstances. He believed their love could exist separate from her family's activities. Isabella wept when he told her, a mixture of joy and sorrow. She knew better than he did what his decision meant. There would be no normal life, no simple future. But she loved him too much to refuse his choice. The engagement happened quickly. Salvatore Torrisi approved of Marco's decision, seeing in him a young man of honor who chose love over safety. The engagement party was held at the Torrisi compound outside Palermo, a fortress-like estate with high walls and discreet security. Marco met the extended family, cousins and uncles who controlled various aspects of the organization. Some welcomed him warmly, appreciating that Isabella had found happiness. Others watched him with suspicion, wondering if this outsider could be trusted. Isabella's cousin Stefano was particularly hostile, having hoped to strengthen his own position by marrying Isabella himself. The wedding planning revealed the surreal nature of Marco's new life. Discussions of flower arrangements were interrupted by hushed phone calls about territorial disputes. The guest list required careful balance between rival factions. Even choosing the church involved considerations of security and symbolic power. Marco tried to maintain his work at the restoration firm, but it became increasingly difficult. Clients began treating him differently when they learned of his connection to the Torrisi family. Some projects mysteriously received expedited permits, while others were quietly cancelled. Giuseppe, his supervisor, grew distant and fearful. 3 months before the wedding, violence erupted. A rival family, the Volpes, challenged Torrisi control over the port districts. What started as business disagreements escalated into open warfare. Bodies appeared in alleyways, and car bombs shattered the morning peace. Isabella was moved to a secure location, and Marco found himself under constant guard. The bodyguards assigned to Marco were professional but distant. They followed him everywhere, transforming his daily routine into a choreographed dance of security protocols. He learned to check under his car for explosives, to vary his routes, to notice when someone had been following too long. Isabella grew increasingly stressed as the violence continued. She had hoped to shield Marco from this aspect of her world, but the war made that impossible. She spoke of leaving Sicily entirely, of starting fresh in another country. But both knew her father would never permit it, and she could never truly abandon her family. The conflict reached its peak when Stefano Torrisi was ambushed outside a nightclub. He survived, but 3 of his men did not. The attack was seen as a direct insult to Salvatore Torrisi, requiring a proportional response. The old man convened a meeting of his top lieutenants to plan retaliation. To everyone's surprise, Salvatore included Marco in the meeting. Not as a participant in planning violence, but as a witness to the family's deliberations. He wanted his future son-in-law to understand the weight of decisions made in those rooms, the careful balance between showing strength and avoiding police attention. Marco watched in fascination and horror as strategies were debated. Some advocated for immediate, brutal retaliation. Others counseled patience and economic warfare. Salvatore listened to all perspectives before making his decision, a targeted strike against Volpe operations that would cripple their income without excessive bloodshed. The plan succeeded, forcing the Volpes to seek negotiation. A tense peace was brokered, with territories redrawn and compensations paid. The war had lasted 2 months and claimed 12 lives. For the Torrisi family, it was considered a minor conflict, barely worth remembering. For Marco, it had been a glimpse into an abyss. With peace restored, wedding preparations resumed. Isabella tried to recapture their early happiness, planning honeymoon destinations and discussing future children. But Marco had changed. The violence had shown him the true price of loving Isabella, not just accepting her family, but becoming part of their world. He began learning the unwritten rules of Mafia life. Never discuss business outside the family. Always show respect to elders, regardless of personal feelings. Loyalty above law, family above everything. He studied these codes not from desire for power, but from necessity for survival. Salvatore took an increasing interest in Marco's education. He would invite him for long dinners where he explained the history of the Sicilian families, the traditions that governed their behavior, the delicate ecosystem of crime and politics. He spoke of it as a burden of leadership, a responsibility to maintain order in a chaotic world. The wedding day arrived with all the pomp expected of a Mafia princess's marriage. The cathedral was filled with flowers worth more than most people's annual salaries. The guest list read like a who's who of Sicilian power, both legitimate and otherwise. Police maintained a discreet distance, knowing better than to interfere. Isabella looked radiant in her designer gown, but Marco could see the sadness in her eyes. They both understood that this ceremony was not just joining two people, but binding Marco permanently to the Torrisi family. There would be no divorce, no walking away. The vows they spoke carried weight beyond religious sacrament. The reception was held at the family compound, transformed into a fairyland of lights and music. Salvatore gave a speech welcoming Marco to the family, his words carrying subtle warnings alongside genuine warmth. The other families sent representatives bearing gifts and messages of respect. Even the Volpes acknowledged the union with an ornate silver set. As the evening progressed, Marco found himself pulled into conversations with various family members. They spoke of business opportunities, of construction projects that needed architects, of ways he could contribute to family enterprises. He realized they were already planning his integration into their operations. Isabella and Marco managed to steal moments alone during the reception. She apologized repeatedly for the life she had brought him into, but he silenced her with kisses. He had made his choice with open eyes, understanding the cost. Their love would have to be stronger than the forces trying to corrupt it. The honeymoon in Santorini provided a brief escape. For 2 weeks, they were just newlyweds exploring Greek islands and making love in a villa overlooking the sea. Marco could almost forget the bodyguards discreet maintaining perimeter security. Isabella laughed more than she had in months, temporarily free from the weight of her name. Reality returned when they arrived back in Sicily. A package waited at their new apartment, architectural plans for a new hotel complex the Torrisi family was developing. Salvatore expected Marco to lead the project, lending legitimate credentials to the enterprise. It was presented as an opportunity, but Marco understood it was also a test. He threw himself into the work, designing a beautiful resort that would actually benefit the local community. He insisted on fair wages for construction workers and environmental protections that exceeded requirements. Salvatore observed these choices with interest, seeing in Marco a different approach to family business. The hotel project brought Marco into regular contact with family operations. He attended meetings where legitimate business mixed seamlessly with criminal enterprise. He learned to recognize which contractors paid protection, which suppliers moved more than construction materials, which officials had been bought. Isabella watched her husband's transformation with growing concern. The idealistic young architect was still there, but overlaid with a pragmatism that came from accepting uncomfortable truths. He no longer flinched when violence was discussed at dinner. He had learned to see threats before they materialized. Their first year of marriage passed in this strange equilibrium. Marco worked on family construction projects while maintaining ethical standards where possible. Isabella pursued her art gallery, creating a space for beauty in a world often defined by ugliness. They found happiness in small moments, quiet evenings when they could pretend to be a normal couple. The dynamic shifted when Isabella became pregnant. The news filled both families with joy, but also heightened security concerns. A Torrisi heir would be a valuable target for enemies. The baby would be born into a life of protection and privilege, but also constant danger. Salvatore began speaking of legacy, of traditions that would need to be passed down. He saw in the unborn child the future of the Torrisi family, someone who might bridge the old ways with modern times. He spoke of Marco taking a larger role, of preparing to guide the family into a new era. Marco felt the walls closing in. He loved Isabella desperately and already loved their unborn child. But he could see the path laid out before him: deeper involvement in family business, moral compromises that would accumulate like sediment until he no longer recognized himself. Late one night, as Isabella slept beside him with one hand resting on her growing belly, Marco made a decision. He would find a way to protect his family while maintaining his integrity. He would use his position within the Torrisi organization to steer it toward legitimate enterprises, to slowly transform it from within. It was a dangerous game. The old guard, men like Stefano who profited from traditional operations, would resist change. Other families might see reformation as weakness. Salvatore himself might view it as betrayal. But Marco believed it was the only way to give his child a chance at a different life. He began carefully, suggesting legitimate investments that could launder money more efficiently while actually creating legal income streams. He proposed construction projects that would genuinely improve communities while still generating profits. He used the language of crime to advocate for legal business. Isabella understood what her husband was attempting. She supported him quietly, using her influence with her father to reinforce Marco's suggestions. Together, they painted a picture of a future where the Torrisi name commanded respect through power rather than fear. Some family members embraced this vision. Younger cousins who had studied abroad saw the potential for transformation. They were tired of looking over their shoulders, of being excluded from legitimate society. They formed a quiet alliance with Marco, pushing for evolution within tradition. The resistance came predictably from those with the most to lose. Stefano led the opposition, arguing that Marco was weakening the family, making them vulnerable to enemies and law enforcement alike. He pointed to rival families growing stronger through drug trafficking and extortion while the Torrisis pursued hotels and shopping centers. The conflict came to a head when police raided a Torrisi warehouse based on an anonymous tip. They found nothing illegal. Marco had ensured the location was clean, but the raid itself was an embarrassment. Stefano accused Marco of inviting scrutiny through his legitimate ventures. The family was divided. Salvatore called a formal meeting to address the growing rift. In the same room where Marco had once watched war plans being made, he now defended his vision for the family's future. He spoke of sustainability, of building something that could last generations without constant violence. He invoked the coming child, asking what world they wanted to create. Stefano countered with appeals to tradition, to the ways that had made the family powerful. He questioned Marco's loyalty, suggesting that an outsider could never truly understand Sicilian honor. The room grew tense as members chose sides in a fundamental debate about identity. In the end, Salvatore made his decision. He had lived long enough to see the old ways changing. The government was less tolerant, technology made traditional operations riskier, and younger generations wanted different lives. He endorsed Marco's gradual transformation, while maintaining enough traditional operations to avoid appearing weak. It was a delicate balance that satisfied no one completely. Stefano accepted the decision publicly but ceded privately. Marco had won a victory, but knew the war for the family's soul would continue. Every legitimate success would be weighed against lost criminal profits. Isabella gave birth to a daughter they named Sofia, after Marco's grandmother. The baby was perfect, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin. As Marco held her for the first time, he renewed his vow to create a better world for her, even if it meant challenging centuries of tradition. The christening was a major event, with representatives from families across Sicily attending. It was also Marco's first major test as a new power within the Torrisi hierarchy. He had to navigate congratulations that were also assessments, gifts that carried obligations, and blessings that included warnings. Sophia's early months were a blur of joy and paranoia. The nursery was a fortress of security systems and bulletproof glass. Her stroller was custom-made to withstand explosives. Even her toys were checked for surveillance devices. It was no way for a child to live, and it strengthened Marco's resolve to change things. He accelerated his transformation plans, pushing for more legitimate investments and partnerships with international corporations. He hired lawyers and accountants who could structure deals that satisfied both legal requirements and family traditions. Slowly, the balance of Torrisi income began shifting toward legitimacy. The success attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Government officials who had long considered the Torrisi family untouchable began reaching out quietly. They saw in Marco's approach a chance to reduce violence while maintaining stability. Informal understandings were reached, investigations redirected toward less cooperative families. But success also bred resentment. Other mafia families saw the Torrisi transformation as either weakness to exploit or a threat to their own operations. Tensions rose as traditional territories and agreements were disrupted by legitimate business practices. The peace that had held since the Volpe War grew fragile. Stefano, marginalized within his own family, began making overtures to these disgruntled elements. He presented himself as the true heir to Torrisi tradition, someone who understood that power came from fear rather than respectability. His conspiracies were subtle, but Marco's network detected the early signs. The confrontation was inevitable. During Sofia's first birthday party, as the family gathered to celebrate, Stefano made his move. He had arranged for armed men to surround the compound, planning to force Salvatore to reverse course or face civil war. It was a desperate gambit that violated every rule of family loyalty. Marco learned of the threat moments before it materialized. As guests mingled unknowingly, he had to make an impossible choice. Alerting security would turn the birthday party into a battleground. But doing nothing would hand victory to Stefano and doom his transformation efforts. He chose a third option. Taking Isabella and Sofia to safety, he then confronted Stefano directly, alone and unarmed. It was a calculated risk based on his understanding of Sicilian honor codes. By facing Stefano without weapons or guards, he forced a personal reckoning rather than a military conflict. The confrontation in the compound's garden was brief but decisive. Marco spoke not of business or strategy, but of family. He reminded Stefano of their shared meals, of Isabella's love for her cousin, of what would be lost in bloodshed. He offered Stefano a role in the new order, a chance to evolution rather than extinction. For a moment, the future balanced on a knife's edge. Stefano's hand moved toward his weapon, then stopped. Perhaps he remembered better times, or perhaps he simply recognized that killing Marco would mean killing his own cousin's happiness. He stood down, calling off his men and accepting exile rather than war. Salvatore, who had watched the confrontation from his study window, aged years in those few minutes. He saw in Marco not just a son-in-law, but a true heir to leadership. The young architect had shown courage, wisdom, and, most importantly, the ability to resolve conflicts without bloodshed. The aftermath of Stefano's betrayal accelerated the family's transformation. Those who had sympathized with him were given choices: embrace the new direction or leave with generous severance. Most chose to stay, recognizing that Marco's way offered a future their children could inherit without shame. Over the following years, Marco continued his careful balance of reformation and tradition. The Torrisi family maintained its power and influence, but increasingly through boardrooms rather than back alleys. They became power brokers and kingmakers, using wealth and connections rather than violence. Isabella's art gallery became a symbol of this transformation. It showcased not just beautiful works, but also sponsored programs for disadvantaged youth, giving them alternatives to crime. She and Marco worked together to create legitimate opportunities for those who might otherwise follow darker paths. Sofia grew up in a world very different from her mother's childhood. She attended regular schools, played with children whose parents didn't fear the Torrisi name, and learned about her family's history as something to understand rather than continue. Her innocence was protected even as her safety was assured. there were still moments of danger. Rival families occasionally tested Torrisi resolve, requiring responses that balanced strength with restraint. Law enforcement continued watching, ready to pounce on any return to old ways. The balance Marco maintained required constant vigilance and occasional compromise. On Sophia's 5th birthday, as she played with friends in the same garden where Marco had confronted Stefano, he reflected on the journey. He had entered Isabella's world as an idealistic young architect and emerged as a mafia don who built hospitals instead of running protection rackets. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was one he had shaped. Isabella found him in his thoughts and took his hand. She understood the weight he carried, the daily decisions that balanced progress against tradition. Together, they watched their daughter laugh with abandon, free from the shadows that had defined previous generations. It was a sight worth every sacrifice, every compromise, every sleepless night. Salvatore, now in his 70s, called Marco to his study that evening. The old man's health was failing, and succession plans needed formalizing. He officially named Marco his heir, bypassing blood relatives in favor of the man who had shown a path forward. It was unprecedented, but, unopposed, Marco had proven himself beyond doubt. The transition of power happened gradually. Marco assumed more responsibilities while Salvatore provided counsel and historical context. The old Don's final years were spent watching his family evolve into something he couldn't have imagined but had come to respect. He died peacefully, knowing the Torrisi name would endure. Marco's leadership was tested immediately. Other families saw the transition as an opportunity to challenge Torrisi dominance. Some sought to pull them back into traditional operations, while others tried to claim their legitimate businesses. Marco navigated these challenges with a combination of negotiation and carefully applied pressure. He had learned that complete legitimacy was impossible, the family's history and connections were too deep. Instead, he aimed for a sustainable hybrid, using minimal illegal activity to maintain respect while building legal empires that would eventually make crime unnecessary. It was a generation-long project that required patience and vision. Isabella proved an invaluable partner in this transformation. Her international education and cultural connections opened doors that muscle never could. Together, they built alliances with legitimate businesses, government officials who appreciated stability, and even reformed members of other crime families seeking similar evolution. Sophia's education became a priority. She attended the best schools but also learned family history from carefully chosen tutors. She understood her legacy, both its dark past and hopeful future. Marco and Isabella raised her to be proud of her name while determined to further cleanse it. By her 10th birthday, the Torrisi family controlled a business empire spanning construction, hospitality, shipping, and technology. Most operations were entirely legal, with only enough traditional activity to maintain old alliances and prevent power vacuums. Marco had achieved what seemed impossible: respectability without weakness. The transformation came with costs. Some family members, unable to adapt, drifted away. Others struggled with identities built on fear and reputation. The family reunions grew smaller but more genuine, populated by those who embraced the new vision rather than merely tolerated it. International law enforcement took notice of the Torrisi evolution. Some remained skeptical, viewing it as an elaborate facade. Others saw it as a model for organized crime transformation, proof that traditional structures could evolve rather than simply be destroyed. Academic studies were written about the Torrisi model of criminal reformation. Marco never forgot his origins as an idealistic architect. He insisted that family construction projects meet the highest standards of design and sustainability. The hotels, shopping centers, and residential complexes bearing the Torrisi name became known for quality and innovation. It was his way of honoring both his past dreams and current reality. Isabella's gallery grew into a cultural institution, sponsoring artists worldwide and bringing legitimate prestige to the family name. She created scholarship programs for young Sicilians, giving them opportunities to study abroad as she had. Many returned to contribute to Sicily's transformation, creating a positive cycle of change. As Sophia entered her teenage years, she began asking harder questions about family history. Marco and Isabella answered honestly, explaining the violence and corruption that had built their fortune. They also explained the responsibility that came with inheritance to continue transforming that dark foundation into something worthy. The girl showed remarkable maturity in processing this information. She understood that her comfortable life was built on others' suffering, but also that her parents had worked to change that equation. She declared her intention to study law, to use legal tools to complete the transformation her father had started. It was during Sophia's high school graduation that Marco received unexpected news. The government was offering the Torrisi family complete amnesty in exchange for full cooperation in dismantling remaining criminal networks. It was a chance for total legitimacy, but it would require betraying old alliances and possibly endangering family members. The decision tormented Marco for weeks. Accepting would mean final transformation, but at the cost of violating honor codes that still mattered in Sicily. Refusing would mean maintaining the delicate balance indefinitely, always one step from either criminality or betrayal. He consulted with Isabella, with trusted advisors, and, finally, with Sophia herself. His daughter's response surprised him. She argued for accepting the amnesty, not from naive idealism but from pragmatic assessment. The old codes were dying anyway, she said. Better to control the transition than be crushed by it. The family needing to discuss the government offer was the most tense since Stefano's betrayal. Opinions were divided between those who saw opportunity and those who sensed trap. Marco listened to all perspectives, weighing honor against future, tradition against transformation. In the end, he chose a middle path that satisfied his conscience if not everyone else. The family would cooperate with authorities in dismantling truly harmful operations, drug trafficking, human smuggling, extortion of legitimate businesses. But they would not betray individuals who had shown loyalty, instead offering them paths to legitimacy. The process took 2 years and required delicate negotiations with both government officials and crime families. Some viewed the Torrisis as traitors, while others saw them as pioneers. Violence was threatened but largely avoided through careful diplomacy and strategic concessions. When the amnesty was finalized, the Torrisi family emerged as something unprecedented, a former Mafia dynasty operating entirely within the law. Their business empire remained intact, their influence preserved through legitimate channels. They had achieved what Marco had dreamed of that first night after meeting Salvatore. Sophia enrolled in law school with a clear mission. She would use her education to help other families make similar transitions, to prove that evolution was possible. Her thesis on organized crime transformation drew on personal experience while maintaining academic rigor. Professors were impressed by her insights and dismayed by their sources. Marco and Isabella, now in their 50s, could finally relax their vigilance. The bodyguards remained but more from habit than necessity. They traveled freely, no longer checking for surveillance or varying routes. Their love had survived tests that would have destroyed most relationships. At a family dinner celebrating Sophia's law school graduation, 3 generations gathered around the table. Salvatore's portrait watched from the wall, and Marco could almost sense the old man's approval. They had honored his legacy while transforming it into something he couldn't have imagined but might have admired. The conversation that night ranged from legal precedents to architectural innovations to upcoming art exhibitions. It was the dinner of a successful, legitimate family with interests in culture and business. Only those who knew their history would recognize the miracle of that normalcy. As the evening ended and the family dispersed, Marco stood on the terrace overlooking Palermo. The city lights twinkled below, each one representing lives and stories intertwined with theirs. He thought of his younger self, stepping off that bus with dreams of restoring old buildings. In a way, he had fulfilled that dream. He had taken the crumbling edifice of the Torrisi crime family and restored it into something beautiful and functional. It hadn't been the project he'd expected, but it had become his masterpiece. The boy who wanted to preserve history had instead transformed it. Isabella joined him on the terrace, still beautiful after all their years together. She knew his thoughts without words, another skill developed through years of reading dangerous situations. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their city and remembering their journey. Sophia found them there, legal diploma in hand and fire in her eyes. She spoke of her plans, a foundation to help crime families transition to legitimacy, partnerships with international organizations, perhaps even political office. Her parents smiled, seeing in her the culmination of their sacrifices. The story of Marco and Isabella Torrisi became legend in Sicily, told in different ways by different people. Some called it a betrayal of tradition, others a triumph of love over violence. The truth, as always, was more complex, a tale of choices made and prices paid, of love strong enough to transform worlds. Years later, when Sofia had become a respected judge and the Torrisi name was synonymous with philanthropy rather than fear, she would tell her own children about their grandparents. About a young architect who fell in love with a mafia princess, and together they wrote a different ending to an old story. The fortress compound where Stefano had attempted his coup was transformed into a community center. The chapel where Marco and Isabella first met became a museum of Sicilian history, acknowledging both light and shadow. The Torrisi hotels employed thousands in legitimate jobs, and Isabella's galleries had discovered dozens of young artists. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, those don't exist in the real world. There were still those who remembered the old days with either nostalgia or bitterness. There were still moments when the family's past cast shadows on their present. But it was an ending they had chosen and fought for, written in love rather than blood. Marco lived to see his grandchildren born into a world where the Torrisi name opened doors to universities and boardrooms rather than back alleys and crime scenes. He had kept his promise to create a better world for them, even if the path had been stranger and harder than he'd ever imagined. When he finally passed, peacefully in his sleep with Isabella beside him, his funeral was attended by judges and politicians, business leaders and artists, reformed criminals and the children they'd helped save from that life. It was a gathering that would have been impossible in Salvatore's day, a testament to transformation through love and determination. Isabella lived several more years, continuing their work and ensuring their legacy. She wrote memoirs that became required reading in criminology courses, honest accounts of life inside organized crime and the possibility of change. She never remarried, claiming that after a love story like theirs, anything else would be anticlimactic. The Torrisi story became a case study in how traditional power structures could evolve rather than simply collapse. It inspired similar transformations in other families, though none quite as complete or successful. It proved that with courage, love, and patience, even the darkest legacies could be redeemed. In the end, the fate that awaited Marco when he was chosen by the Mafia boss's daughter was neither what he feared nor what he expected. It was a life of moral complexity and difficult choices, of love tested by circumstances most couples never face. But it was also a life of profound meaning, where personal happiness became inseparable from historical transformation. The young architect who had wanted to restore old buildings had instead rebuilt an entire family's future. The Mafia princess who had chosen him had risked everything on love and been rewarded with a partner strong enough to change their world. Together, they had written a love story that was also a redemption story, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, choice and determination could create light. Their legacy lived on in the legal empire they built, the lives they saved from crime, and, most of all, in their descendants who bore the Torrisi name with pride rather than fear. It was a fate none of them could have imagined that first day in the dusty chapel, when a young man with dreams met a young woman with secrets, and together they chose to write their own ending.